science and reason and rationality is the way out of this situation, is how we fix the problem. And almost to me, the details don't matter. Conveying that notion is enough for me.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. On my episode today, I'll be exploring a favorite topic, science fiction, with a friend and fellow space industry colleague who is also an up-and-coming Canadian science fiction author. We're going to discuss some themes on communicating science and our shared love of science fiction. If you enjoy what you're hearing, please feel free to press like on your podcast app and share it with your friends. We'd love to hear from you. Eric Choi is a writer, editor, and aerospace engineer in Toronto. He has twice won the Prix Aurora Award, Canada's national prize for excellence in science fiction and fantasy, for his short story Crimson Sky, and for the anthology The Dragon and the Stars. And he was the first recipient of the Isaac Asimov Award, now the Dell Magazines Award, for his novelette Dedication. His short fiction has appeared in more than 24 publications in Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, Hungary, and Japan. He holds a B.A.Sc in engineering science and an M.A.Sc in aerospace engineering, both from the University of Toronto, as well as an MBA from York University. In 2009, he was one of the top 40 finalists out of 5,351 applicants in the Canadian Space Agency's astronaut recruitment campaign. Eric, welcome to The Rational View.
Thanks, Al. It's great to be here.
So, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself? Are you from Toronto originally? How old were you when you started reading science fiction?
I was actually born in Hong Kong. My parents worked at the airport there, so I think that was probably the early genesis of my interest in, as a minimum, things that go into the sky, and later on, I guess, things that kind of go beyond the sky. In terms of my interest in science fiction, I'm one of these people that's old enough to remember the original Star Trek series, although I do emphasize I did not watch it in its original run, but merely in syndication many years after the fact. And one of my earliest recollections, having this really lousy TV, back in the day in Brampton, Ontario, in the family home, was this grainy footage of this unfortunate man in a red shirt who was just about to be consumed or devoured or dissolved by some acid-secreting creature, which I later learned was, of course, the classic episode, The Devil in the Dark. It actually scared the hell out of me, but I found that something really compelling about that show, Star Trek, and really that's what I think got me interested in science fiction. And as I got a little older, my parents did one of the most beautiful and important things that any parent can do besides being a parent, is to introduce me to that wonderful institution called a public library. And it was there that I started reading the stuff. So sort of the old school Arthur Clarke stuff, and a lot of the genre fiction, the Star Wars and the Star Trek novels back in the day, and I'd say it sort of got started from there.
We, I think, originally met in the very small world of the Canadian space industry. You've been involved in a number of Canadian space science missions. I think that apart from the Canadarm, Canadians are mostly ignorant about our involvement in space science as a whole. The world is soon going to be seeing some really beautiful images from the James Webb Space Telescope that we built the fine guidance sensor for here in Ottawa. I mean, very few people are probably aware of that as well.
Right. And you, of course, were personally a big part of that.
A small part of a big team. But really looking forward to these images coming out. Can you tell us all a little bit about what you've worked on in the space industry?
Well, maybe I'll get started with perhaps a bit of a shameless plug for my day job employer, which is a Montreal-based small business called GHGSat. So we at GHGSat, we have 3 microsatellites in orbit right now that are doing facility level greenhouse gas methane monitoring. So what's unique about our satellites is the ability at very high spectral and spatial resolution to detect these methane emissions literally down to the facility level, down to, say, an individual landfill or an oil and gas facility. And this is remarkably something that nobody else in the world right now, and this little company out of Montreal is able to do this. And further to your point, Al, and something that we like to talk about is literally everything we do at GHGSat is done in Canada. Except for the launch, and there's people working on launching from Canada as we speak. But the spacecraft buses, the platforms, are built right here where I am in Toronto at the Spaceflight Laboratory. Al, your company Honeywell is GHGSat's partner in the aircraft version of the sensor. The space sensor is built by ABB in Quebec. We've got partners in Newfoundland and Labrador, and a company called Secor that helps us out with the ground segment. So, everything in this remarkable enterprise is done in Canada. And in my own career, I've had the privilege in a very small way to be involved, as we both have been, Al, in remarkable projects like KeySat, the quantum encryption and science satellite, which in just, I guess, a very few short years' time, we'll be demonstrating revolutionary quantum key distribution between Earth and space. And in my own career, I've been fortunate to have been involved in projects like sending a meteorological LiDAR instrument to Mars as part of Canada's contribution to the Phoenix Mars lander mission. And I started my undergraduate thesis was actually with Dr. James Drummond, now retired, long retired, at the University of Toronto on a carbon monoxide sensing instrument called MOPIT. So there's a wide breadth of Canadian space activity, far beyond our the much deserved accolades for Canadarm and Canadarm2 and soon to be Canadarm3. And as Canadians, perhaps we're a little modest about these accomplishments, but I think once in a while it doesn't hurt to stand up and cheer a little bit.
Yeah, no, the work that's being done at GHGSat is revolutionary and very important, I think, in identifying stray methane emissions that maybe aren't being reported in the current GHG monitoring scenarios. I think there are some other instruments up there that measure methane at low resolution over country scales, and this is mainly to support reporting on GHG components and the market for trading. How much does this country emit versus this country? So it's very broad scale, low resolution, but that being able to actually locate it down to the oil well or the gas well that's fracking and releasing methane. Methane is, for those of the listeners who don't know, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's got a short lifetime in the atmosphere, about I think 25 years or something like that. So it's not as long lived in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, but it's one of these things that has it's 25 times worse than carbon dioxide, but it's got a shorter lifespan in the atmosphere. So it's very important that we don't emit this. So it's quite a useful tool, I think. And are there things that you can talk about discoveries that your system's making?
Well, I just want to emphasize the point you made where you talked about the challenge of methane, as you have just so well enunciated there, the outsized global warming potential of methane over short durations. But there's actually a good news story in there, if you can believe it, because what that means is if we are proactive and aggressive in reducing methane now, we can have an outsized climate benefit in the near term. You also mentioned some of the other methane sensing satellites up there, and I think that also brings up an interesting and important point, is that we've been seeing over the last couple of years this remarkable emergence of, I don't even know what the term is now, but it used to be called new space or small space or commercial space or 2.0. Basically, private or philanthropic in some cases or commercial ventures doing some of these space activities. And I think it's important to emphasize that it's not an either or proposition. It's not government space programs or the commercial sector. It's both of these working in a complementary manner and very much a synergistic manner to help us accomplish, the things that we want to do from a scientific standpoint or any other activity we would want to do in space. And GHGsat is a great example of that. So there are other methane sensing satellites up there. I can cite one example being the Tropomi instrument on the Sentinel-5P satellite of the European Space Agency. So we at GHGsat have had an ongoing scientific collaboration with ESRON. This is the Netherlands Space Research Institute and the Sentinel-5P team there and the team at the European Space Agency, where we work in synergy. So, Al, as you said, that this Tropomi instrument being one example of this, it looks on sort of broad regional scales. So a very wide swath, I believe something on the order of 2,500 kilometer swaths and 5 by 7 kilometer pixels. And what they do is they can see areas of elevated methane, for example, and then they can task or they can tip and queue a satellite like ours at GHGsat. So indeed, we'd get a notification and say, hey, we've seen something very interesting here in Central Asia, in Turkmenistan, for example. Can you folks have a look and try to identify the source? And indeed, I citing that Central Asia, Turkmenistan example, this has happened a number of times where we've identified significant emissions coming out of oil and gas facilities in places such as this. So very much working in synergy, and this type of thing is going to continue as we have new philanthropic missions like Methane Sat and new government missions like Geocarb. This is really the methane moment. I think it's all hands on deck, precisely for the reasons you enunciated, Al, of the outsized climate impact of methane. It's all good. Like every sensor we can get up there is fantastic.
Yeah, no, it's very important, especially with the links between the renewable energy rollout and the gas backup that's required, and the fracking that seems to be. If I think the numbers are if gas mining releases something like 3% of the methane into the air through the fracking process, then the gas is actually as bad as coal in terms of its greenhouse gas footprint. So, but I don't want to talk too much about this. I want to kind of let's talk more about science fiction. You've just published a new book, Just Like Being There. I think it's an anthology of your science fiction stories.
Well, first of all, the book is out, but maybe just as a bit of a nitpick, I'm not the one publishing it, so it wasn't the one, with the elbow grease and the printing press there. So it's the publisher is actually Springer Nature, which most of us would probably be more familiar with as an academic publisher. They actually have a science and fiction line. as unusual as that sounds, but I actually think that's really cool because they also see the value of science fiction in terms of science communication. I'm sure this is something we'll chat about a little later. But I had the privilege a few years ago of appearing in another one of these Springer science and fiction anthologies. It was called Science Fiction by Scientists, edited by a Professor Mike Brotherton. And so it was, through those connections to Springer that I sort of pitched the idea that, over the course of many years now, I've built up, a little bit of a repertoire of stories. And so the idea I had was to reprint some of those stories and also produce a new story, which I did. It's called A Sky in Heaven. It's actually the closing story. But the other thing that I proposed, which they really liked, was that in addition to the stories themselves, I include a short afterword following the stories that explain the scientific or engineering background behind the story that a reader has just read. So this collection has just come out, and it's got 15 of what's called hard SF stories. So these are the ones that are allegedly, anyway, scientifically consistent and try to follow known laws of current laws of science with reasonable extrapolations, and a few of my alternate history stories as well. So what might have happened if this particular Chinese-born rocket scientist had not been deported from the United States as he was in the 1950s, or what might have been done to possibly save the astronauts on the space shuttle Columbia back in 2003. And that's the subject of the new story, A Sky in Heaven, which closes the collection.
Wow, that's great. I love hard science fiction. This is often based in reality and speculating about new discoveries or new understandings. And my favorite thing is when I get a new idea or I'm inspired by a story. One of my favorite authors who's done that repeatedly was Greg Egan. I first read Diaspora a few years ago, and I was kind of blown away by his depiction of the future where societies can transfer their consciousness to supercomputers and experience the universe at different speeds depending on their chosen clock rates. And he had a great sequence in that where there was a new AI was generated and becomes sentient. So here's a question I usually ask at the end of my interviews. Which author inspires you? What do you like in science fiction? What's your favorite?
Well, it's hard to pin one down. As I said earlier in my remarks, as a young person, as a kid, I did read a lot of sort of the older classic, so-called classic stuff. So, I was very much inspired by Arthur C. Clarke, for example, and recognizing that back in the day, he was, of course, himself having an engineering background. So the notion of somebody with a technology or technical background being able to write and having that as a forum to as you say to express just cool ideas about stuff. So what would you do if you had a space elevator like like in the Fountains of Paradise, or stuff like Rendezvous with Rama, which perhaps not a lot there from a characterization or plot standpoint, let's be honest, but my goodness, were there, sort of cool ideas and cool physics being explored in that. And I think that's, that's part of what interests me the most, as you say, as sort of like a playground for new ideas. And indeed, I think it was Larry Niven who called science fiction as sort of like a playground of the mind, and as a way of getting interesting ideas out there. As a kid, I vividly remember reading in Analog a series of short stories by James Gunn, the Grandmaster, who he had these stories. So it was like a time traveler with the generic name of Bill Johnson, and this person would go back in time and do something to fix some kind of societal ill. But every time he did that, the circumstances under which he was sent back in time had changed, so he loses his memory. So he has to write these little notes to himself to remind himself of who he is and why he's there, but why he's doing what he's doing. But one of the stories I remember, and unfortunately I've forgotten the title, is it was a story that dealt with pollution and environmental degradation, and the solution that was come up with was the idea of putting a fee or a price on emissions. And my goodness, this is carbon pricing. This is cap and trade, and this was something that was at least, if not the first, then one of the early conceptualizations of this was in science fiction. In terms of authors that I personally like, we're very fortunate, I think, in Canada that not only do we have a vibrant and very active and highly contributing space program that I wish that more people knew about, but Canada has also been a great place for science fiction writers. So I should add as well, science fiction writers, many of whom themselves have a scientific background. For example, people like Primi Mohammed, who won a Nebula Award this year. She is a molecular geneticist from Edmonton. Peter Watts from Toronto, and I think you and I both share a love of his novel Blindside. So he's a marine biologist. Julie Cherneda, who's now in the Ottawa area. She's a biologist by background, and I have to admit to a little bit of a conflict of interest with Julie Cherneda, because not only has she been very kind to have purchased a number of my stories, but in one of her early novels, In the Company of Others, I'm actually a character in her novel, and as Eric Choi, and I don't die or anything, which is really really remarkable. Robert J. Sawyer, another great Canadian science fiction writer. Robert Charles Wilson, American Canadian science fiction writer that I very much enjoy. And in terms of short fiction, I like stuff by Ted Chiang and Ken Liu. So you could. I'm sure anybody can have a terrific list. There's just so much good stuff out there.
I wish I had more time to read. And you mentioned as Peter Watts and Blindside. That was something I think you recommended to me a couple of years back. It was a great story from which I've actually I took inspiration. I mean, I loved the idea. It explores the idea that's supported by a lot of studies that consciousness is just an emergent process of our complex brains, and that maybe volition and free will is something of an illusion. I think similar to the philosopher Daniel Dennett is suggesting. And this is something I'm exploring on the podcast right now is the theories of consciousness and how our subjective experience, how our subjective experience is maybe just a post hoc narrative of what the body is actually doing on its own without our conscious involvement, all of the subconscious things. And Blindside was a great example. So I really appreciate that you send me that link, and this, now you have a whole list of other ones that I have to read. So I feel like science fiction inspired a lot of people like you and I maybe to enter STEM fields and go through university and get degrees and contribute to imagine better worlds that we could strive for together. The Star Trek universe, for example, as you said, kind of shows us a future world where the nations of Earth can cooperate, and as the Federation of Planets. People rarely mention struggling for money on Star Trek. It's a world where there's plentiful food and energy, and people are working to better themselves. And this is the sort of world that some of us are striving for. And I think society has come to a bit of a crossroads right now, where there's a lot of people that are saying we need to turn our backs on technology and go back to nature and return almost to a simple dark ages kind of situation, and there's this a tension, I think, in society between the two, the futuristic decoupling that is promoted by the Star Trek universe and is exemplified by the eco-modernist movement. When you're writing science fiction, are you trying to convey a message for the future?
Perhaps not overtly, but a lot of the issues that you enunciated there are very much on my mind. So if, gratuitous plug, if you were to be so kind as to pick up a copy of Just Like Being There, I think you can sort of see a pattern in a lot of my works that at the end of the day, it is, reason and rationality are important, and that this is the way that we get ourselves out of trouble, and this is the way that that we solve problems. And technology is neutral. At the end of the day, as human beings, we choose to use that for good or ill. But if we do choose to use it for good, then you're absolutely right. We can build that aspirational future that in many ways has been so powerfully enunciated and portrayed in various works of science fiction, both on the page and on the screen.
Yeah, it exemplifies different models and it allows us to explore in our mind's eye what could be if maybe certain change is difficult. Change displaces people that are doing well and gives things to other people, and it's difficult to see the path to get to these changes that we might want to see in society. And communicating science, I think, is at the root of some of these things. It's challenging in a world where social media is creating echo chambers, and these echo chambers are being exploited by vested interests to amplify alternative facts, for example. How do we communicate science better to people? Is there what can we do as scientists and engineers I feel like we're not doing a good job. Do you have any insights into what we can do?
Well, I think some of us are doing a good job. I won't speak for myself, but I'll speak for you, Al. So certainly venues like the Rational View podcast is you doing your part to spread the good word and in a very powerful way. I'll mention that the title story of my collection, Just Like Being There, originally appeared in a series that I mentioned Julie Cherneda earlier. So Julie Cherneda is very much involved and very passionate about science education, particularly at younger ages and younger grades in school. So Just Like Being There originally appeared in a series that she did called Tales from the Wonder Zone, which were science fiction stories targeted at young readers that reflected the then science curriculum in the province of Ontario for particular grade ranges. So there is, I think, a lot to be said about starting at a young age, and ultimately a lot of it is in order to counter perhaps some of the negative influences that you've cited there, Al, is if those types of narratives are out there and being broadcast, then it's equally important or greater important that people like yourself through the Rational View are also equally standing up and sort of shouting from the rooftops, if you will, and trying to be heard. I'll maybe say one thing about some of the media type, quotation mark science fiction like Star Trek. You talk about, how can we promote science? Well, let's be honest. Like, a lot of the media stuff, and indeed a lot of science fiction, and I would put some of my stuff in the same category. The science is not always rigorous or realistic, and in some cases that it is, it may not have aged well over time. But I would argue that almost doesn't matter as much as sort of the philosophical notion that the Star Trek particle of the week type of thing. It's all nonsense, of course, but the fundamental notion there was that science and reason and rationality is the way out of this situation, is how we fix the problem. And almost to me, the details don't matter. Conveying that notion is enough for me, and I think that's a good thing.
No, I agree, and that's definitely where I've been coming from as well. And thank you for the kind words about the podcast. This definitely is the way I think that I can make a difference. I think in the past, science and technology got caught up with institutional issues and has created some mistrust. You have people afraid of big pharma, which then believe that, vaccines are bad, or people afraid of things that, or justifiably who have been hurt by actions of large corporations or institutions that have used power over them in not a great way. And I think this shouldn't reflect on the science and technology. What it should reflect on is how we build our social institutions and how we work together in a better way going forward. But there are people that have taken this to say science is bad, technology is bad, almost a Luddite perspective that we seem to be encountering in a lot of social interactions. So that's the sort of message that I try to convey in a lot of cases, is that science is a tool. It's not good or bad. It's not, we're not all mad scientists out to take over the world. Speaking for myself, most of those people are mad engineers.
I have to confess there might be some truth to that. Well, to your point, I think I'd like to paraphrase David Brin, who is, another great example of a science fiction writer who himself has a scientific background. I believe he's an astronomer. But, David Brin has pointed out that a lot of this, skepticism or questioning of science and institutions actually comes from a good place. That we should be skeptical, we should be questioning, and we should be challenging existing institutions, existing power structures. But I think what's equally important to realize is that science itself actually embodies all that the process of science is constantly questioning and constantly self-critical and constantly self-correcting, which ultimately is why science works, and why it's trustworthy, and that on net balance it has been a positive thing for the human race. And I think we talked earlier about science education, and as a personal opinion, maybe where we need to change science education is not to portray it as sort of established facts that are brought down on high from authority, because scientists or engineers or whomever else can be as right or wrong as anybody. Because what that happens is you set up this thing as, well, I read ABC from this non-scientific source, and I read X, Y, and Z from this, and they're just presented to me as statements. How do I know, which one is credible, which one to believe? And ultimately, I think an important science literacy education is not the presentation of established statements, but to educate on the scientific method, frankly, scientific processes, the fact of the fundamentals of testing hypotheses and data and the weight of evidence, which is why ultimately, and it is therefore for this reason that if you're told something from this scientific source versus this other source, why the scientific source tends to be more credible, that you should probably lend more lend more weight to.
Yeah, no, that's an important point. Science is not a dogma. Science is an evolving collective set of measurements and observations about our universe, where we together try to converge on a better understanding of the processes. And I've encountered this, when I was in university. I was TAing first year physics, and people would do experiments and measurements in their classroom, and then they would present the results and say, well, this result is wrong because it doesn't agree with the expected value. And I said, no, you're doing science. Your measurement is as valid as the expected number. And, as long as you capture the uncertainties in your measurement and say, okay, we've measured this, it's way off of the expected number, but these are the uncertainties in the measurement. You can see that because of, our we don't use, very precise measuring equipment, that we're far off. And this is a valid scientific measurement. You are contributing to scientific knowledge. You are not comparing to a dogma. And then it's that sort of living organism that is science that people need to understanding. It's not a dogma. Dogma is for religions. Science is something that you have the ability to upend and if you make an observation that's different, that's valid. That's what science is about, is you making your observations and comparing them and understanding and finding people that you can respect that are also doing the same sort of thing. And if you need to, you can reproduce all of the measurements, if you have enough money and equipment.
Well, Al, you're a very kind and excellent TA, and I wish I had you as a TA in my undergrad. When in undergrad physics lab, I did the Millikan oil drop experiment and came up with a value of E over M that was 2 orders of magnitude greater than the commonly accepted value, which I thoroughly attribute to my own incompetence, and so I would dismiss that right away as having any sort of validity.
Well, yeah, certainly there could be other factors involved, but so this is good. I wish I had more time to read, and thank you for all the recommendations of Canadian authors on the science fiction scene. This is great. I really appreciate your recommendations. I mean, I remember, I read the Foundation series when I was very young, and iRobot and Dune, and one of the books I remember was Poul Anderson's Tau Zero. I don't know if you're aware of that. It was a really cool story about a runaway Bassard ramjet that basically they couldn't put the brakes on, so they decided to accelerate it. And because of time dilation, as they approached the speed of light, they watched the universe evolve and then die and recollapse and emerge in a new universe. It was really a cool story that, like, whoa, this is great. Yeah,
that was Tau Zero, right? Yeah. Some of the examples you cited there, what I think has been fantastic as well is there have been, recent screen adaptations of Foundation and Dune that I think are bringing these wonderful stories to a whole new audience, which is fantastic.
Yeah, that's something that wasn't very popular. When we were younger, I think it was mostly your movies were westerns and
westerns or samurai stories in space, which is ultimately what the first Star Wars movie was, right?
I can see that's true. Yeah, no, I feel very lucky to be able to experience some of the explosion of the genre in film right now. It's great fun. Really enjoy it. So I think we're getting to the end of our time slot here. It's been a a pleasure chatting with you, Eric. I appreciate you coming on. For coming on, I'm going to send you a T-shirt of the
Thank
Rational
you so
View.
much.
And I really appreciate it. Great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Oh, the pleasure's mine, Al, and I hope that COVID permitting, we'll be able to catch up in person at some point.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.